I remember the exact sound the table made when Marcus set down his wine glass, that small, clean click of crystal on wood, because it was the last ordinary sound of the evening. Everything after it had a different quality. Sharper. More permanent. "Oh, come on," my wife said, leaning back in her chair with the particular ease of someone who has decided the evening belongs to them. She was smiling at our friends the way she smiled when she was performing rather than feeling, wide, slightly theatrical, eyes moving around the table to collect reactions. "Let's be honest. Emory is many things, but ambitious isn't one of them." She picked up her own glass. "He's comfortable. That's the word, isn't it? Comfortable." She said it the way you'd say soft. Or small. Some people just settle for comfortable. The table had 6 people at it. Marcus and his wife Diane. Our neighbors Joel and Carrie. And us, Nadia and me, at either end of a table she had set with care that afternoon, with the good linen and the candles she only brought out when she wanted the evening to reflect well on her. No one said anything for a moment. Marcus looked at his glass. Joel rearranged his fork. Diane, who is the most honest person I know and who has never in her life looked away from something uncomfortable, looked directly at me. I smiled. I said something mild and self-deprecating that I don't remember precisely, because my brain was doing 2 things simultaneously, maintaining the surface of the evening and registering, underneath, with a cold and absolute clarity, that something had just ended. Not the marriage. Not yet. That would take another 4 months, a series of conversations I was not yet ready to have, and one night alone in the kitchen at 2 in the morning when I finally understood the difference between patience and erosion. But something ended at that table. Some last reserve of the willingness to absorb. My name is Emory. I'm 42 years old. I'm a secondary school history teacher, have been for 15 years, at the same school, in the same classroom with the same view of the playing fields that turns extraordinary in October when the light goes amber, and even the students notice it. I am not, by most financial measures, a high earner. I own a modest car, a house I'm proud of that I bought with savings accumulated over years of careful living, and a set of values about what work means that I arrived at deliberately and have not, in 15 years, found reason to abandon. Nadia is 38. She works in financial consulting, earns considerably more than I do, and has, in the 6 years of our marriage, made me aware of this disparity in ways that range from the gentle to the surgical. She is beautiful, organized, socially gifted, and capable of a cruelty so precisely calibrated that it could pass, in company, for wit. That evening at the dinner table was not the first time she had diminished me in front of others. It was, however, the first time she used the word loser, not directly, not as a noun applied cleanly, but in the circling, deniable way she did most things. Some people are just comfortable, with the implication underneath it as clear as anything said plainly. I drove home that evening. We'd had the dinner at our house, so I drove nowhere. I washed up while Nadia debriefed the evening in the satisfied tone of someone who felt it had gone well, and then I sat in the kitchen alone after she went to bed, and I thought for a long time. Not about what she'd said. About the fact that I had smiled. About how long I'd been smiling. The marriage had not always been this. I want to say that clearly, because stories like this one tend to collapse the past into a single shape, as if the ending were always visible in the beginning, as if anyone paying attention would have seen it coming from the first week. That's not honest. The beginning was real. The early years were genuinely good, in the way that things built on partially false foundations can still be genuinely good for a significant period, before the weight of what's underneath begins to show. Nadia and I met at a mutual friend's housewarming, one of those crowded, slightly too warm evenings where you end up having a real conversation with someone because the room is too loud for anything else, and you've both migrated to the same corner. She was funny, precise, unexpectedly well-read about things I didn't expect a financial consultant to have opinions on. She asked questions and then actually listened to the answers, which is rarer than it should be. I walked home that night thinking about her in the way you think about someone when you already suspect they're going to matter. For the first 2 years we were together before marrying, the difference in our incomes was a practical fact rather than a loaded one. We split things fairly, adjusted for capacity, didn't make it a referendum on anything. She came to my school's open evening once and talked to my students about careers with a warmth and specificity I hadn't expected. I helped her prepare for a presentation she was anxious about, and when it went well, she called me first. We were, I think, genuinely good for each other then. The shift was gradual and didn't announce itself. Looking back, I can trace it to somewhere in year 3 of the marriage, around the time her firm promoted her to senior consultant and her income increased substantially. The promotion was deserved. She had worked for it with the focused intensity she brought to everything she decided to pursue. I was genuinely glad for her. But something changed in how she positioned herself, and by extension how she positioned me. It started with small things. Comments about the car I drove, not unkind exactly, just the kind of observation that contains an implied comparison. You could get something better, you know. References to colleagues who had bought in certain neighborhoods, taken certain holidays, achieved certain benchmarks, offered not as interesting information but as ambient measurement. She began describing my job and company with a particular inflection, Emory teaches, which is wonderful, that managed to sound like a compliment while functioning as a ceiling. I noticed these things and I did what I had always done with things that made me uncomfortable in the marriage. I gave them the most generous available interpretation. She was proud of her own success and still finding the vocabulary for it. The comparison wasn't intentional. The inflection was my projection. I was, as I have been told by more than one person who cares about me, excessively patient and excessively willing to interpret in other people's favor. The first time she diminished me in front of others was at a work event of hers, a client dinner I'd been invited to as her partner. Someone had asked what I did, and I described my work in the terms I always used, that I taught history to 16 and 17-year-olds, that I found it meaningful, that the question of how we understand the past seemed to me more urgent rather than less as time went on. Nadia, beside me, had smiled at the client in the way of someone managing a social situation and said, "He's very dedicated to it. Not everyone could do what he does for what he earns." The client had nodded politely and moved the conversation on. I had looked at my bread plate for a moment, and then looked up and continued talking, because what else do you do, in a room full of people, when your wife has just translated your vocation into a financial inadequacy? I mentioned it afterward. Quietly in the car. "I was defending you," she said. "I was saying it takes a certain kind of person." "It sounded like you were apologizing for me," I said. She looked out the window. "You're too sensitive," she said. I filed it. I gave it the generous interpretation. I was, perhaps, too sensitive. This is what erosion looks like from the inside. Not dramatic. Not sudden. Just the steady wearing of stone by water, so gradual that the stone doesn't register the change until the shape it used to be is already gone. I want to be precise about what I mean when I say suspicion, because in this story the thing I was growing suspicious of was not an affair or a deception in the conventional sense. It was something more diffuse and, in some ways, harder to name, the suspicion that the marriage I was living in had a different meaning to Nadia than it had to me. That what I experienced as a partnership, she experienced as a hierarchy. And that the hierarchy was not incidental to her, not a bad habit or an unexamined pattern, but something more deliberate. Something she needed. The evidence for this assembled itself slowly, across the year before the dinner party, in the form of patterns I kept refusing to fully read. Pattern 1, the public versus private self. In private, Nadia was capable of genuine warmth toward me. There were evenings, weekend mornings especially, when she was entirely herself in the good sense, funny, engaged, affectionate in the easy way of someone who is comfortable. It was this version of her that kept me oriented, that I returned to whenever the other version became difficult. But the other version, the one that performed for company, that calibrated her words for effect, had grown more prominent over the years, and its effects were consistently in one direction. She was funnier, more interesting, more powerful when I was made smaller. I noticed this and did not name it for a long time. To name it would have required admitting something I wasn't ready to admit. Pattern 2, the repair cycle. After any incident, the client dinner, a comment at her parents' house about my career prospects, a remark at a colleague's birthday that landed with a weight she claimed not to have intended, there was always a period of warmth. Attentive, generous warmth, the kind that felt like recompense without ever being named as such. She would cook something I loved, or suggest a weekend away, or be physically affectionate in a way that had become less common. I would feel the relief of it, and tell myself I'd misread the incident. That I was, as she had said, too sensitive. The repair cycle is one of the most effective mechanisms in a certain kind of damaging relationship. It keeps the injured party oriented toward the good version rather than the full pattern, because the good version is real and the full pattern requires you to hold more discomfort than the repair makes necessary. Pattern 3, the financial dimension. Nadia had, in the last 2 years, begun to make unilateral decisions about significant household expenses, a kitchen renovation, a holiday she'd booked without full consultation, furniture she'd ordered and presented as accomplished fact, while simultaneously positioning my income as the limiting factor in what we could do together. The logic was never stated plainly enough to argue with, but its structure was consistent. She earned more, therefore her preferences governed. I earned less, therefore my preferences were aspirational rather than practical. She had, I eventually understood, begun to treat the house, which I had bought before we married, which existed because of savings accumulated across years of work she considered insufficient, as a reflection of her taste rather than our shared life. I raised this once, directly, in the spring before the dinner party. "You make decisions about the house without talking to me," I said. "I make decisions because someone has to," she said. "And because I have better taste." She said it without cruelty. That was the thing. She said it as if it were simply true, an acknowledged fact between us that I had somehow failed to accept. I looked at her. I thought about 15 years of teaching, about the student I'd stayed late for 3 Tuesdays in a row the previous autumn until she understood the causes of the First World War well enough to write about them with confidence, about the colleague I'd mentored through their first year, about the work I did that was not visible in any financial metric but that had shaped, in real ways, real people. "Better taste," I said. "You know what I mean," she said. "Yes," I said. "I do." I left the room. I walked around the block twice in the cold, and when I came back she was watching something on the television and the moment had apparently passed, which was another of her skills, the ability to let a conversation end by simply not continuing it, leaving the other person to either relitigate or absorb. I absorbed. And that is where I was, psychologically, when the dinner party arrived, already carrying 6 years of absorbed comments, a repair cycle I could map with precision, and a slowly forming understanding that the marriage had a structure I had not agreed to and that did not suit me. The word loser, implied at the candlelit table, was not the cause of what followed. It was the weight that broke the surface of what was already full. The night of the dinner party, after Nadia went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and did something I had not done before. I wrote things down. Not a list of grievances. Not a document for any legal or practical purpose. Just a record, honest, chronological, written in the same plain language I use when I'm trying to understand something historical. What happened, when, what was said, what it meant. I filled 4 pages of a notebook I found in the kitchen drawer. Then I read them back. Reading your own account of your own marriage, written in one sitting at midnight, is a particular experience. It is the difference between living inside something and standing outside it. The shape it makes from the outside is different, not more dramatic, but clearer. Less obscured by the warmth of the repair cycles, less softened by the genuine good moments, less distorted by the daily forward motion of ordinary life. What I read, in 4 pages of my own handwriting, was a marriage in which I had been consistently smaller at the end of each year than at the beginning. In which my choices, professional, personal, financial, had been systematically repositioned as limitations rather than values. In which the person I was with had become, over 6 years, someone who needed me to be insufficient in order to feel sufficient herself. I closed the notebook. I made a cup of tea I didn't drink. I sat for a while longer in the kitchen that had been renovated without my meaningful input into a version of itself that didn't quite feel like mine. Then I called Marcus the next morning. Marcus had been my closest friend since university. He had sat at the dinner table the previous evening and looked at his wine glass when Nadia said what she said, and I needed to know what he had heard, not his interpretation, just what he had heard. "You want me to tell you it was as bad as it felt?" he said. "I want you to tell me what you heard," I said. A pause. "I heard her call you comfortable in the tone of someone saying something else," he said. "And I heard the table go quiet in the way it goes quiet when something true has been said out loud in the wrong context." "The wrong context," I said. "The wrong context for her," he said. "She meant to say it privately. She let it out publicly. Those things happen when something has been thought often enough that it stops feeling like a private thought." I sat with that. "She thinks it," I said. "Emory," Marcus said. "She's been saying it in various forms for 2 years. The rest of us have been watching you absorb it. Why didn't you say something?" "Because you weren't asking," he said. "And because it's your marriage." He was right on both counts. I hadn't been asking. I'd been managing, absorbing, interpreting generously, running the repair cycle without naming it. And it was my marriage, which meant the decision about what to do with what I was understanding belonged to me. I spoke to Diane, Marcus's wife, the most honest person I know, the following week. She had looked directly at me across the table, the only person at the dinner who had. I met her for coffee on a Tuesday afternoon, and she said, within the first 5 minutes, with the clean directness that I had always admired in her, "How long has she been doing this?" "Longer than I admitted," I said. "What are you going to do?" "I'm not sure yet," I said. "I need to understand it first." "You understand it," she said. "You've understood it for a while. The question is what you're going to do with the understanding." She was right. The understanding had been there, assembled in pieces, waiting for me to look at it whole. The dinner party had not given me new information. It had forced me to stop looking away from what I already knew. I found a therapist in March, 2 months after the dinner, 1 month into a period of internal reckoning that had changed the quality of every interaction in the house. Her name was Claire. She worked from a small office near the school, and she had the useful quality of asking questions I hadn't thought to ask myself. In our second session, she asked, "When did you stop feeling like yourself in the marriage?" I thought about it. "Year 3, I said. "What happened in year 3? "Her promotion," I said. "And then, I think I started trying to justify myself. In the way you justify yourself to someone who's questioning your worth. I started being more patient, more accommodating, more present. As if I could prove something." "What were you trying to prove?" I looked at the window. "That I was enough," I said. "To her?" Claire said. "I'm not sure," I said. "Maybe to myself." That distinction, between trying to prove myself to Nadia and trying to prove something to myself, was the most useful thing I found in those months. Because what I eventually understood was that I had been so committed to the project of earning her regard that I had stopped maintaining my own. I had been so focused on being enough for her that I had stopped asking whether the version of enough she was measuring me against was one I actually respected. It wasn't. It had never been. And the clarity of that, once I let myself look at it, was both devastating and, underneath the devastation, something that felt like relief. The conversation I'd been moving toward for 4 months happened on a Saturday evening in May. Not planned, or not planned in the sense of a date marked on a calendar. But it arrived in the way that conversations arrive when the pressure behind them has been building for long enough, inevitably, through an ordinary moment that happened to be the last one. We had been to the grocery store. A mundane Saturday errand, the kind that constitutes the connective tissue of shared life. In the car on the way home, Nadia had mentioned, casually, in the tone she used for things she'd already decided, that she'd seen a flat she liked. Not for any stated purpose. Just seen it, liked it, mentioned it. "A flat," I said. "It's beautiful," she said. Modern. The kitchen alone. We have a house, I said. The house is fine, she said. But it's not where I thought we'd be at this point. I pulled into the driveway. I turned off the engine. I sat for a moment. Where did you think we'd be? I said. She made a small gesture with her hand, vague, encompassing, that meant something she didn't want to specify. More, she said. I looked at the house through the windscreen. The house I had bought. That I had maintained. That I was proud of, had been proud of, until the word comfortable had been applied to it in a tone that made it sound like an apology. Come inside, I said. I want to talk. We sat in the living room, not the kitchen, which felt like her territory, but the living room, which was more neutral, which had the bookshelves I'd built myself one weekend 3 years ago that she had never commented on. I sat in the chair. She sat on the sofa. The evening light was coming through the front window at the angle that made the room look its best. I need to tell you something, I said. And I need you to hear it without managing it. She looked at me with the particular attention she gave situations she was assessing. The dinner party in January, I said. What you said? Emory. Let me finish, I said. Not just January. The client dinner in year 3. Your parents' house at Christmas. The comment about the car. The renovation you planned without me because you have better taste. The way you say he teaches in company like it's a diagnosis. I paused. I've been absorbing this for 4 years. I've been absorbing it, and interpreting it generously, and waiting for a version of you that looks at my life and sees something worth respecting. She was very still. You called me comfortable, I said. You said it in front of Marcus and Diane and Joel and Carrie, and the table went quiet because everyone heard what you meant. And I smiled. I've been smiling for 4 years. You're being dramatic, she said. But her voice was quieter than usual. No, I said. I'm being precise. There's a difference, and you know there is, because precision is something you respect. She looked at her hands. A long pause. I don't think you're a loser, she said. I know, I said. I think it's worse than that. I think you think I'm not enough. And I think you've thought it for a long time, and I think you've been right that I've been trying to prove otherwise. And I've decided to stop. She looked up. What does that mean? It means I'm done trying to earn something from you that you've decided I don't deserve, I said. It means I'm not going to keep making myself smaller to fit a version of this marriage that makes you feel bigger. And it means I think we need to decide, honestly, whether there's anything here worth staying for. The silence that followed was the longest of our marriage. I don't want to lose the house, she said. Eventually. I looked at her. I thought about 4 years of absorbed comments, and renovation decisions, and the client dinner, and the word comfortable in the tone of an apology. I thought about the notebook with 4 pages of my own handwriting at midnight. I thought about Claire asking when I stopped feeling like myself, and my answer, year 3. I know, I said. But that's not the conversation we're having. She cried. I want to record this honestly, she cried, and the crying was real, and it was genuinely painful to witness, because whatever she had made of the marriage, she was not a person without feeling. She told me she hadn't meant things the way they landed. She told me she was under pressure she hadn't shared. She told me she was proud of me, that she'd said it poorly, that she wanted to do better. I listened to all of it. I didn't move from the chair. I believe that you mean that right now, I said when she finished. I also know that you meant what you said in January. Both of those things are true. So what do we do? She said. We decide, I said, whether you can actually see me, the person I am, doing the work I do, living the way I live, as something worth choosing. Not something to be improved or managed or apologized for. Just chosen. She didn't answer immediately. And the pause, which stretched past the point where an honest yes would have arrived, told me what I needed to know. We separated in June. The process was, by the standards of these things, relatively civil, Not without pain, not without difficult conversations about the house and the finances and the mutual friends who would have to navigate the aftermath. Nadia moved into a rented flat. The house, my house, built from my savings, now genuinely mine again, settled back into itself around me. Marcus and Diane had us separately to dinner on alternating months, with the careful diplomacy of people who loved both parties and refused to pretend otherwise. Joel and Carrie sent me a message that said simply, "We're here. Whenever." Which was exactly right. I am still a history teacher. I want to say this first, because it was the thing most consistently positioned as the problem, and it remains entirely unchanged, and this feels important. I teach the same students, in the same classroom, with the same view of the playing fields that turns extraordinary in October. Last autumn, a student I'd taught 3 years ago came back to the school to use the library and stopped in to see me and told me that the way I'd framed the question of historical causation had changed how she thought about everything, about choices and consequences and the way one thing leads to another in ways you can't always see from the inside. She was 19. She was going to study politics. She had a specific, alive intelligence that I recognized as something that had been there at 16 and had been, I like to think, given a little more room in my classroom than it might have been elsewhere. I drove home from school that evening and I sat in the kitchen Nadia hadn't renovated, the original kitchen with the slightly battered countertop and the window that sticks in summer, and I felt something that I want to describe accurately, not triumph, not relief, not the showy satisfaction of someone who has won an argument. Something quieter. The specific feeling of being entirely yourself in the life you have actually chosen. The year since the separation has been instructive in the way that difficult years are instructive, not pleasantly, but genuinely. I have learned things about myself that I would have preferred to learn less expensively. I understand now that my patience, which is real, which I don't think of as a flaw, had been operating without a crucial component, the willingness to name what I was being patient about. I had been patient in the way of someone who mistakes endurance for virtue, who equates absorbing with understanding, who believes that enough generosity of interpretation will eventually produce the relationship you're interpreting toward. It doesn't work that way. Generous interpretation is not the same as honest engagement. An honest engagement sometimes requires saying, plainly and without management, "This is not acceptable, and I am telling you so directly," and the response to that statement will tell me what I need to know. I said that eventually. In May, in the living room, in the chair. And the response told me what I needed to know. Nadia and I do not have significant contact. The separation was managed through solicitors in the way that protects both parties when the emotional terrain is complicated, and what remained on the other side of it was a clean division of a shared life into its component parts. She has the flat she liked, not the one she'd seen in the car, but one she found afterward, modern and precise in the way she preferred. I have the house. I have, also, something more difficult to name but more important than the house, the daily experience of not monitoring myself. Of coming home and being in the rooms without calibrating. Of having opinions about things and expressing them without running a prior calculation about how they'll land. Of being, in the specific and unglamorous way of someone who has recovered something they didn't know they'd lost, entirely recognizable to myself. Claire, my therapist, asked me, near the end of our sessions, what I would say to an earlier version of myself. The version who sat at the dinner table in January and smiled. I thought about it. I'd say, "The smile is costing you more than the confrontation would," I said. I'd say, "Patience is only a virtue when it's moving towards something." And I'd say, "The people at the table can see what you can't. Listen to what the silence is telling you." She nodded. "What is the silence telling you now?" she said. I looked at the window. "That it's mine," I said. "The silence. For the first time in a long time, it belongs to me. There are things I still carry from the marriage that I expect to carry for some time. Not bitterness. Bitterness requires a sustained effort that I'm not willing to make. But a certain wariness. A heightened attention to the difference between a relationship that makes you more yourself and one that makes you a managed version of yourself. Between someone who sees you clearly and chooses you anyway, and someone who sees what you're not and calls it intimacy. I know the difference now in the way you know something that was learned expensively, with the precision of information paid for rather than given. The October light is on the playing fields again as I write this. 42 years old, one classroom, one house, one life assembled from choices I made deliberately and am prepared to defend. Not to anyone in particular. Just prepared to defend them. Prepared to stand in them without smiling apologetically. That, it turns out, is what enough feels like. Not more. Just enough, held without apology. That's sufficient. More than sufficient. On the good days, it's everything. At its structural core, this is a story about a particular kind of damage that operates without drama, the slow, consistent repositioning of one person's worth by another, conducted through the ordinary channels of daily life and social performance until the original shape of the person is so eroded that even they have difficulty locating it. The psychological mechanism at the center of Nadia's behavior is worth examining precisely, because it is not the mechanism of cruelty in the conventional sense. She was not, by most readings, a cruel person. She was a person who had organized her self-concept around achievement and acquisition, and who required, perhaps without full consciousness of the requirement, a contrast figure against whom her achievements could be measured. Emory, steady and unambitious in her terms, served this function. His contentment made her restlessness legible. His sufficiency made her more visible. The diminishment was not incidental to the relationship. It was structural to how she experienced herself within it. This is the story's most uncomfortable insight, and the one worth sitting with. Nadia needed Emory to be insufficient. Not because she disliked him, but because his insufficiency, measured against her particular scale, was the foundation on which her sense of superiority rested. When she called him comfortable in the tone of an apology, she was not venting frustration. She was maintaining a structure. At what point do you think Emory could have named this? The client dinner in year 3 is the earliest clear moment, the first time the private diminishment became a public performance. That was the point at which the pattern had consolidated enough to be visible from the outside. He named it in the car. She called him too sensitive. And he absorbed it, which is the moment the pattern was confirmed for both of them. She could set the terms, and he would accommodate. The repair cycle deserves particular attention because it is one of the most effective mechanisms in this kind of dynamic, and one of the least discussed. After each incident, warmth. After each wound, attentiveness. The person being managed experiences the warmth as evidence that the incident was an aberration, that the real relationship is the warm one, that patience will eventually produce more of this and less of the other. What the repair cycle actually does is maintain the person in a state of hope that prevents them from reading the full pattern. Emory was not naive. He was being given just enough warmth, at just the right intervals, to sustain his investment in the marriage's better possibilities. The dinner party functions as the story's pivot not because it contained new information, but because it made the private public in a way that couldn't be reinterpreted. The table's silence was the signal. Not just that something wrong had been said, but that it had been heard, confirmed, witnessed. Emory could no longer manage the incident as a private misunderstanding. It had been seen. And what had been seen could not be unseen. His choice to write things down that night, 4 pages, plain language, chronological, is one of the story's most significant moments of agency. It is the choice to stop managing the information in his own head through the filter of generous interpretation and to look at it whole. The shape it made from the outside was the shape of a long, consistent pattern. That was not new information. But it was information held differently, and the different holding changed what it required of him. Would you have reached for the notebook sooner? And if you had, would you have been ready to read what it said? From a wider perspective, this story describes something that sits at the intersection of 2 deeply human tendencies: the tendency to organize our self-worth around external validation, and the tendency to give the people we love the benefit of a doubt that eventually costs us the truth. Nadia's behavior reflects what happens when personal identity becomes contingent on comparative superiority, when being more requires someone else to demonstrably be less. This is not a stable foundation for a relationship, because it means the relationship's health is inversely tied to the partner's well-being. Every time Emory succeeded, felt confident, occupied his life with visible satisfaction, the structure Nadia had built required adjustment. The diminishment was maintenance. The accumulation effect in this story is quiet and devastating in equal measure. No single incident was insurmountable. No single comment was, on its own, grounds for the response that eventually came. The dinner party comment could have been apologized for. The client dinner could have been reframed. Any one moment, in isolation, was survivable. The full pattern, held whole and read without the softening of the repair cycle, was not something a person of Emory's self-awareness could continue to absorb once he had actually looked at it. The point of no return is the living room in May, not because the conversation itself was the breaking point, but because of the pause that followed his question. Can you see me, as I am, as something worth choosing? The pause that stretched past the moment when an honest yes would have arrived. That pause contained more information than any of the previous 6 years, because it was the first moment in the marriage when there was no repair cycle available, no generous interpretation possible, no management strategy adequate to the directness of the question. What Emory ultimately learned, at significant cost over significant time, is the difference between patience as a virtue and patience as avoidance. Real patience moves toward something, toward understanding, toward resolution, toward a truth that the waiting is serving. What he had been practicing was a different thing, patience as a method of not having to name what he could see, of not having to sit with the discomfort of an honest assessment of his own marriage. The smile at the dinner table was not composure. It was the final expression of a strategy that had run out of road. What he carries forward is not the wound, but the knowledge. The specific, hard-won knowledge of what it feels like to be entirely yourself, in your choices, your work, your life, without the ongoing labor of justification. That knowledge, once acquired, changes what you're willing to accept. Not through bitterness or armor, but through clarity. The clarity of someone who knows the difference between a relationship that sees you and one that requires your insufficiency. And who has decided, simply and permanently, never to mistake one for the other again.